Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, a mayoral candidate whose identity spans continents.
Mamdani, who was born in Uganda, checked a box that he was Asian, but also checked the box for Black or African American on his Columbia University application.
As the New York City mayoral election heats up, why is Zohran Mamdani's identity an issue? I'm Malika Bilal, and this is The Take. Before we continue with today's show, remember to leave us a comment telling us what you think about this episode, or leave us a review on your favorite podcast app and give us a 5-star rating while you're there. It really helps the show.
My name is Aina. I'm a British-Pakistani freelance foreign correspondent, and I travel the world telling stories.
Aina, it's good to have you here. Welcome to The Take. Where am I catching you today?
Thanks for having me, Malika. I'm actually in Islamabad, Pakistan.
Well, thank you for taking time out of your reporting schedule to talk to us. We are just weeks away from the New York City general election, in which residents are going to vote on who they want their mayor to be. And whether our viewers around the world follow local U.S. politics or not, chances are they have heard the name Zohran Mamdani by now. I know that you have followed his rise in the polls for a little while now. Who is he and how does he identify?
Zohran Mamdani is a political phenomenon in the United States. He could potentially be the next New York City mayor. He's a Democrat, socialist, and his political ascent has come at a time where there is an immense fracture in American politics. Traditional politics is not really resonating with people, and suddenly Mamdani's just exploded onto the political scene, providing, I guess, for working people, at least for those from immigrant communities, a breath of fresh air in terms of addressing real life problems that are affecting them in terms of rent and transport in one of the most expensive cities in the world, which is New York City. So yeah, his political journey so far has been really interesting because his family he doesn't come from a political lineage. And it seems that his journey is resonating not just in the US with working class people, but far, far beyond in the African continent as well, where he has roots.
So, Aina, we are speaking on Monday, and a day before our interview, New York City Mayor Eric Adams dropped out of the city's mayoral race, halting his re-election campaign just weeks before Election Day. That has to come as welcome news to the Mamdani camp because that can only mean good things for him and his rise.
I'm looking to lead a city of 8.5 million people. And so much of this general election has been reaching out to those who have questions or concerns and making clear that our affordability agenda is a universal one.
His election would be historic for many reasons. Can you walk me through why this is such a big deal?
If Mamdani becomes the mayor of New York City, he's going to be the first mayor who is Muslim. He's going to be the first mayor who is of Indian descent and also has that complicated, hyphenated identity of being Ugandan as well. And, this is in a city where there was so much hostility towards Muslims post 9/11 with the war on terror. It's really a groundbreaking moment in so many ways to potentially have a mayor like that who shares those identities in a city like New York.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mamdani is also a former rapper under the stage name Young Cardamom, and he makes no secret that he is from Uganda. He even paid tribute to his hometown in one of his songs, Number One Spice, in 2016. You were recently in Uganda, and you wrote about it for The Guardian in a piece entitled Binary Thinking: Why Zohran Mamdani's African Identity Doesn't Fit U.S. Racial Boxes. So what drew you to cover this part of the story?
As you said, I've been following Mamdani's political ascent, and I decided to travel to South Africa in April and move there for a couple of months. It really changed my frame of thinking as someone who is of Pakistani origin, as someone who's from what we call in the UK a minority ethnic community, where a minority pushing against the dominant community, which is majority white. And the ways in which race was taught to me, socialized to me as a child growing up, it was so different to what I had been exposed to in South Africa. There seemed to be a different conversation going on around race. In particular, can someone be multiple things at once? Can they be Ugandan? Can they be American? Can they be Indian? It seemed a no-brainer for some people within the continent. Whereas once you went outside to the global north, to the UK and the US, it was a very different conversation.
So he was born in Kampala before moving to New York at age 7, but that has shaped his identity beyond his childhood, and we see aspects of that today. What did you learn about his connection to the continent?
I mean, the neighborhood that Mamdani grew up in is quite affluent, actually. And the old house that he used to live in had a view. It was on a hill and it would overlook Lake Victoria, which spans not just Uganda, but, parts of Kenya as well. It was really interesting to see where he grew up, but then also connect the dots in terms of, okay, how can someone, at least class-wise, who's from an affluent background, resonate with working people all the way in the United States? And that's because he's an immigrant. One of the things that I really learned while I was in Kampala is the pride that Ugandans have for him, because one of the Ugandan men that I interviewed described him as a son of Africa. And that really, I think, is a sentiment that I gauged from the people that I spoke to there. They're not obviously a representation of the entire country, but yeah, there was a real sense of pride as to the fact that this man, who is very proudly Ugandan, doesn't hide that side of his identity, was ascending to a really significant political position in the United States.
Well, then I want to take this conversation to the U.S. now, because it will come as no surprise that anyone who has followed U.S. political campaigns ever, that during this race, Mamdani's background has been turned into a political weapon. And his racial identification has been under a microscope since a hack in July exposed a 2009 college application form where he checked both Asian and Black/African American. The New York Times broke that story, and U.S. conservatives accused him of trying to manipulate race-based college admissions policies. Tell me about where that information came from and the firestorm that it caused.
That information apparently came from a man called Jordan Lasker, who's a well-known eugenicist and neo-Nazi. And the thing is, as journalists, when we interview confidential sources, we don't disclose who gave us that information. But that New York Times story just caused such an explosion and an outrage because of so many factors, including the source that they were protecting potentially was someone whose intentions were very, very questionable. And, there are nuances to this as well. It depends on who is criticizing Mamdani. If it were an African-American who came forward and was like, I have real issue with this man ticking African-American, we're talking about a very different kind of criticism here, because it's coming from someone from a disenfranchised community who has a personal connection to that racial category. But when it comes from a newspaper that is using a source that is deeply questionable, that's quite questionable ethics. And again, it does make you question intentions as well.
In your reporting, you explain that Ugandans of Indian descent, like Mamdani, are widely considered and embraced by indigenous Ugandans as Africans. But in the U.S., Mamdani would not be considered African American, which is a very specific term typically reserved for descendants of Africans who were enslaved in the U.S. And Mamdani says he does not consider himself African American. So how does this personal connection to Africa and to Uganda shape the way Ugandans you spoke with see him? What did they see him as?
For Ugandans, in terms of ethnicity, of course, he's considered Indian, but in terms of his Africanness, there wasn't any objection to at least for the people that I spoke to, of him claiming an African identity. I think vantage points are really different. How race is spoken about within that continent, such a vast continent of 54 countries, is very different to how it's spoken about in the US. So it's interesting. One of my African-American friends, I was speaking to her about this, and she was like, Aina, I don't trust his intentions. We've had people of color within the States exploiting affirmative action schemes in the US for so many years, while African-Americans remain disenfranchised. So there was that perspective. But then there was also the perspective where say we're giving grace to Mamdani and he wasn't taking African American to try and get a leg up. If his intentions were good, he was just trying to capture his complicated identity in the racial category box that seemed to fit it the best, and it was African American because it had African in it.
Intertwined with this criticism on his intentions and what he might have meant has also been this conversation around where he's really from, whether or not that makes him eligible to be the mayor of New York City. So he's drawn criticism for taking his eye off the ball in July after he announced an extended trip to Uganda to celebrate his wedding when you were there at the same time. He addressed the haters by reading some of the quote unquote go back to Africa comments from online trolls, and it comes across funny.
For example, at SamWhite087, Zohran, go back to Uganda where you come from and belong. At Teflon Gone, loser, go back to Africa. There are thousands like this from across the country. I hear you. And I agree. I'm going back to Uganda.
It comes across tongue-in-cheek, but also pushing back firmly against this narrative. And I'm wondering, based on your reporting, how people take that criticism.
There was one young Ugandan man, happened to be black, that I spoke to. He was a student at Makerere University where Mamdani's father, Mahmoud Mamdani, taught in Uganda. I was speaking to him and he was saying to me how the backlash against Mamdani, his race, whether he is American enough, he was like, it reminds me of Barack Obama when Barack Obama was trying to become nominated as the presidential candidate. He was like, there was that whole birther scandal. The rumor that Barack Obama was not born in the United States, the fact that his father is Kenyan, that was weaponized. Being born in the US is a prerequisite to becoming the president of the United States. So there was a real effort to discredit Obama's legitimacy to become president. But really, when you strip back all of that, what that whole thing was about was Obama is not American enough. Mamdani also cannot be American enough because he wasn't born in the US, because he has connections outside. There's an otherizing that happens to politicians of color that you see in a lot of global north countries. The UK is no exception. When we had our first Muslim mayor of Pakistani descent elected, Sadiq Khan also faced a lot of racist backlash. So it's a really common tactic. And I guess you'd think it will be getting old in 2025.
More with Aina after the break.
Up to 100,000 children go missing in China every year, a number that links back to the 1970s and the one-child policy. This story is about one of those children and the mother who spent decades searching for him. What's happening to China's children? Hear the full story on True Crime Reports.
Well, Aina, it's a useful coincidence for us that Zohran's own father, Mahmoud Mamdani, has written pretty extensively about complicated identities, exactly what we've been talking about, including his own Indian Ugandan experience and the 1972 expulsion of Asians from the country. In your reporting, you trace the historical foundations of Ugandans of Indian descent. How did Indians come to be in Uganda under British rule?
Indians came to be in Uganda because of British colonialism. So slavery was abolished in the 1830s, and something called indentured labor, which was basically a contractual agreement between colonizing powers, say the British, and those who are, say, from the Punjab state of India. It was a contractual agreement where they would come and migrate over and provide a labor service. But this wasn't a contract of equity. These people were treated significantly poorly. Their wages, I don't even think in some instances they got some, but they were treated so badly that in some ways it was a form of slavery without the actual label. So the British brought these Indian laborers over to East Africa because they were trying to build a railway that would connect Uganda to the Indian Ocean. They built this railway for economic purposes. And once it was completed around turn of the 1900s, those Indian laborers stayed in Uganda, but, over 30,000 of them were brought. And Again, the conditions were horrible. Several thousand people died in the process of these railways being built. There's even documented stories of lions in the Kenyan savannah eating these people alive. So this is how Indians, should I say Ugandans of Indian descent, this is how most of them came to parts of East Africa and Uganda.
Wow. Well, as I mentioned, in 1972, the Indians who came to Uganda under British rule were expelled under Idi Amin. And Mamdani has talked about this himself, appearing on the Sarah Silverman podcast in 2020 when he was running for state assembly.
They turned on the radio one day, and over the course of a few minutes, they were informed by the then president of Uganda, Idi Amin, that all Ugandans of South Asian origin were to be expelled from the country within 90 days.
Talk to me about the legacy of that period today. Does it still show up in Uganda?
Today, Ugandans of Indian descent, including Mamdani's family, only make up 1% of Uganda's population. But since independence until today, they contribute a very significant amount to the economy of Uganda. They are the wealthiest ethnic minority in Uganda until today. And that, in some ways, that wealth, that class divide was laid down by colonialism. It's a classic textbook colonial tactic, which the British loved to do, where they built divisions between different racial groups. And what happened when they colonized Uganda was that they favored the Ugandans of Indian descent with education opportunities. They stereotyped them as a really great merchant class who were great businessmen. And they were given opportunities that Black Ugandan counterparts didn't. And fast forward many, many decades, this is what culminated in an explosion of, in some ways, resentment. Uganda gained independence in 1962, and 10 years later, Idi Amin swoops in. He had this dream, apparently. God had told him, expel the Ugandans of Indian descent. There was a real kind of push to reclaim the economy, to reclaim the riches of African land across the continent for the Black indigenous population, because they'd been stripped of it for centuries. So 72, this happens, but I think today in 2025, many Ugandans of Indian descent, they said at the time that they wouldn't go back, but actually there has been an influx of those families going back to Uganda because many of them feel very much Ugandan. They speak one of the local languages, Bugandan, fluently still, even after maybe being separated from Uganda for decades. One of the people that I interviewed for the article that I wrote for The Guardian was also expressing like his childhood memories, eating mangoes, like going to Lake Victoria, like identity is really complicated. Notions of what home is are really complicated. So the trauma for that generation hasn't dissolved because that generation are still alive, but they are slowly going back. And, you know, I think the current president, Museveni, he was actively calling for the expelled generation of Ugandans of Indian descent to return as well. So there's been a reconciliation, I would say.
You mentioned that there are interracial and interethnic strife that still shows up today. What does that look like?
I think one of the biggest things are racism. I was in Kampala. I met an Indian researcher, Amishi Agrawal, who is a researcher on immigration and coffee cultivation in Uganda from the University of Oxford. And Amishi shared really interesting context behind this entire story. She was saying how Mamdani's story, the history of Ugandans of Indian descent, it's not seamless. And, you know, it really does have to be acknowledged as well. Unfortunately, there is intra-racism, there's anti-Black racism among some sections of the Ugandan Indian community. There's class distinctions as well. They are, some of the most prominent businesses, steel, coffee plantations, are still owned by Ugandans of Indian descent. It's not a bad thing, but what it has done is that it's created a real class differential between the vast majority of Black Ugandans today and a minority of Ugandans of Indian descent. So it's complicated. You know, if you look at Zohran Mamdani's mother, Mira Nair, she's an Oscar-nominated director. She did a film in 1991, Mississippi Masala, which documents the story in short of a Ugandan Indian woman who falls in love with an African-American man. It was a really early role for Sarita Chowdhury and Denzel Washington.
Yeah.
And that film, I think, really hits the nail on the head in terms of the multiple ironies that can exist all at once, where you have a family of Indian descent that flees Idi Amin's expulsion in Uganda, ends up in the deep south in Mississippi in the United States, where they face racism, but are racist towards the Black African-American man who falls in love with their daughter. There are multitudes here that really exist. And that's why you might have some people that say, actually, Mamdani can't claim an African identity because this is the context that also exists from within that community. It's complicated.
So you mentioned Mamdani's mother, Mira Nair. Her films often center on marginalized and diasporic identities. His father has a long record of anti-racism and anti-apartheid activism. How has this background, these two storied people as parents, how have they played into Zohran's own politics today?
The fact that both of his parents in their professional careers, the fact that they've centered communities outside of the metropole of empire constantly, consistently over the decades, I think has definitely, undoubtedly diffused its way into Mamdani's politics and Mamdani's upbringing. I think what's also unique about him is that he's able to straddle that world of privilege in some ways, but step out of it as well. The fact that his campaign just really resonated so much with working people, I think tells you a lot. And I really do think a lot of that has come from his parents. Mahmoud Mamdani's research, if you look at the decades and decades of research that he's done focusing on the Rwandan genocide, the Darfur crisis, the so-called war on terror in the United States, he just has multiple etches on his belt where you're like, oh, okay, I think I see some of his arguments and his intellect in some of Mamdani's politics.
So finally, Aina, we know that Mamdani is this international figure because he wants to lead a global city, a city like New York. And as a British journalist, you've watched another race like this. You touched on it earlier, Sadiq Khan's campaign for mayor of London. Can you talk about the kind of power that a mayor of a city like that holds and why it's such a big deal that a person from an underrepresented community or an immigrant might wield it?
My answer is a bit complicated because, on the one hand, as for those of us who are from communities of color, disenfranchised communities, there's definitely merit in seeing people in positions of leadership that look like us. So there's the optics of it. But where it gets a little bit complicated, I think, is when the politics, this is where I'm like, I'm a little bit kind of ambivalent about it. Obviously, the politics that they espouse as well is also important because in the UK, we've had Home Secretaries that are responsible very much for the immigration and the security politics of our country. By the way, one of which, Priti Patel was the Home Secretary under our Conservative Party a couple of years ago. Her parents were Indians of Ugandan descent who were expelled to the UK and found refuge in the United Kingdom. And yet her approach to immigration was utterly, utterly anti-immigration. So seeing someone like yourself in a position of power doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be good for your community. But yeah, I think, if we're going to speak on a surface level, just having someone there that looks like you, it does send a message maybe to a wider public that it can be possible to be American, to be Muslim, to be Ugandan, to be African, at least in the context of Zohran Mamdani.
Well, Aina, thank you so much for this conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. It's been a real pleasure to be on, Malika.